My name is Jake, and this happened during a solo camping trip in the mountains of Montana. I'd been camping alone for years and never considered myself someone who scared easily. Being alone in the wilderness was actually something I enjoyed. It gave me a chance to get away from work, social media, and the stress of everyday life. That particular weekend, I wanted complete isolation. I found a remote location online that looked perfect. According to the map, there were very few campsites in the area. The nearest town was almost an hour away by car. I packed enough food and water for 3 days. At the time, I thought it would be one of the most relaxing weekends of my life. The drive took most of the day. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already beginning to sink toward the horizon. The parking area was almost empty except for one old pickup truck. I didn't think much of it. People came and went from hiking trails all the time. I grabbed my backpack and started the hike into the forest. The trail wound through tall pine trees that seemed to stretch forever. The deeper I walked, the quieter everything became. Eventually, I couldn't hear any traffic or signs of civilization at all. It felt like I had stepped into another world. About 2 hours later, I found a small clearing near a creek. The spot looked perfect for camping. The ground was flat and dry. Tall trees surrounded the clearing on all sides. A small stream flowed nearby, providing a constant source of fresh water. I dropped my pack and began setting up my tent. The weather was cool but comfortable. Not a single cloud could be seen in the sky. Everything about the place felt peaceful. If someone had told me what would happen later that night, I would have laughed. As evening settled in, I gathered firewood and started a campfire. The orange glow pushed back the darkness gathering between the trees. I cooked a simple meal and listened to the sounds of the forest. Birds called from somewhere in the distance. The creek flowed steadily beside the campsite. A light breeze moved through the pine branches overhead. It was exactly the kind of night campers dream about. After dinner, I leaned back in my chair and stared up at the stars. The sky was so clear that it almost looked unreal. I felt completely at peace. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to call it a night. I made sure the campfire was fully extinguished before crawling into my sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped significantly after sunset. I zipped the tent closed and settled into my sleeping bag. The sound of the creek was relaxing. Within minutes, I could feel myself drifting toward sleep. The forest outside seemed calm and quiet. There were no strange noises. There were no warning signs. Everything felt completely normal. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I suddenly woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The inside of the tent was pitch black. I lay still and listened carefully. For several seconds, there was nothing unusual. Then I heard a faint crunch somewhere outside. It sounded like someone stepping on dry leaves. My first thought was that it was probably a deer. Wildlife often wandered near campsites. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. A few moments later, I heard the sound again. This time, it was much closer. Crunch, then silence. Crunch, then silence again. The pattern felt strange. Animals usually moved naturally through the woods. This sounded different somehow. It sounded slow and deliberate. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling of the tent. Every instinct told me to listen carefully. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up. I slowly reached for my phone and checked the time. The bright screen showed 2:13 a.m. Seeing the exact time somehow made everything feel more unsettling. I turned the screen off and listened again. The footsteps had stopped completely. The forest outside was silent. Even the usual nighttime sounds seemed to have disappeared. I could hear the creek flowing nearby. I could hear my own breathing, but I couldn't hear whatever had been making those footsteps. That silence felt worse than the noise. I grabbed my flashlight and held it tightly in my hand. Part of me wanted to unzip the tent immediately and see what was outside. Another part of me wanted to stay exactly where I was. I told myself it was probably an animal. I reminded myself that strange sounds happen all the time in the wilderness. For a minute, I almost convinced myself everything was fine. Then I heard a twig snap directly outside the tent. The sound was so close that I nearly jumped. My heart immediately started pounding. Whatever was out there wasn't far away. I held my breath and listened. A few seconds later, I heard a slow footstep move around the side of the tent. Then another. The sound wasn't moving away. It was circling me. Each step seemed careful and controlled. Whoever was outside appeared to know exactly where my tent was. Sweat formed on my hands despite the cold night air. I stared at the thin fabric wall beside me. Suddenly, a tall shadow passed across the side of the tent. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone in the forest. The shadow disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. For a second, I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The darkness outside made it hard to judge shapes and movement. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Something had walked between my tent and the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. My grip tightened around the flashlight. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Every instinct told me not to make a sound. The forest felt unnaturally quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. The footsteps stopped again. Whoever was outside wasn't wandering randomly anymore. They seemed to be standing still, standing there and listening. I tried to calculate how far away they were. Judging by the sound, they couldn't have been more than a few feet from the tent. The thin layer of nylon suddenly felt incredibly fragile. It offered no real protection from anything. I swallowed hard and fought the urge to panic. My mind raced through every possible explanation. None of them made me feel any better. After what felt like forever, I finally worked up the courage to shine my flashlight. I carefully pointed it toward the tent wall. The bright beam lit up the fabric from the inside. For a brief moment, I expected to see a silhouette staring back at me. Instead, there was nothing, just the wrinkled surface of the tent. The absence of a shadow should have made me feel relieved. Somehow it didn't. It only meant whatever had been there was now somewhere else. That uncertainty was terrifying. At least a visible threat gives you something to focus on. A few minutes passed with no sound at all. I began wondering if whoever had been outside had finally left. Maybe it had been another camper. Maybe someone had gotten lost in the woods. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. It sounded like a faint cough. Not an animal, not the wind, a human cough. The sound came from somewhere just beyond the trees. Every hair on my body stood up instantly. Someone was definitely out there. I stayed frozen inside the tent. My mind immediately started asking questions. Why would another person be wandering through the forest at 2 in the morning? Why hadn't they said anything? Why were they moving around my campsite without announcing themselves? None of it made sense. Most campers would simply call out if they needed help. Most people would make their presence known. Whoever this was had done the exact opposite. They had stayed hidden. That fact bothered me more than anything. Another cough echoed through the darkness. This one sounded slightly farther away. For the first time, I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe they were leaving. Maybe they had finally moved on. I listened carefully as several minutes passed. The forest remained silent. Slowly, my breathing began returning to normal. I even considered trying to get some sleep. Staying awake all night wouldn't help anything. I was exhausted. Eventually, I closed my eyes and tried to relax. Just as I started drifting off, a loud crunch shattered the silence. My eyes snapped open instantly. This sound came from the opposite side of the tent. Whatever had moved away was back, and somehow it had circled around without making a sound. The footsteps resumed, slow, measured, deliberate. They moved around the campsite again. The pattern felt intentional, like someone pacing. I checked my phone again. It was 2:41 a.m. Less than 30 minutes had passed since I first woke up. Somehow it felt much longer. Every minute dragged by like an hour. The footsteps continued moving around the clearing. Occasionally they would stop for several seconds. Then they would start again. I found myself imagining someone standing there staring directly at my tent. The thought made my chest tighten. Fear has a way of creating terrible images in your mind. That night, my imagination was working overtime. Then something happened that I still struggle to explain. I heard 3 slow knocks on the outside of the tent. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was unmistakable. Someone had touched the tent. Every muscle in my body locked up. My breathing stopped completely. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't some misunderstanding. A human being had just knocked on my tent at nearly 3 in the morning. The knocks were followed by complete silence. Whoever was outside didn't speak. They didn't ask for help. They didn't identify themselves. They simply waited. I sat motionless in the darkness, terrified to make a sound. Seconds stretched into minutes. My flashlight remained clenched in my hand. I kept staring toward the side of the tent where the knocking had come from. Then, from somewhere just outside, I heard a low voice whisper something I couldn't understand. And that was the moment true panic finally set in. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whisper. Fear can play strange tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone in the dark. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I had heard a real voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. It sounded more like someone mumbling a sentence under their breath. The words were impossible to understand. All I knew was that another person was standing somewhere outside my tent. That realization hit me harder than anything else that night. I was miles away from help and completely alone. I kept listening, hoping to hear the voice again. Instead, everything went silent. The silence felt heavy and unnatural. Even the creek seemed quieter than before. I slowly reached for the small pocket knife I kept inside my backpack. Realistically, it wouldn't help much if someone wanted to hurt me, but holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. My flashlight remained in my other hand. I was sitting there in complete darkness, gripping both items like my life depended on them. In that moment, maybe it did. Several minutes passed with no sound at all. I considered shouting and asking who was there. Maybe that would scare 'em away. Maybe it would force 'em to reveal themselves. But every instinct told me to stay quiet. A normal person would have spoken already. A normal person wouldn't spend nearly an hour creeping around someone's campsite. Whoever was outside didn't seem interested in having a conversation. That thought kept repeating in my head. It was the one thing I couldn't ignore. Then I heard movement again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It sounded like someone brushing against low branches. The noise came from the edge of the clearing. I pictured a figure standing among the trees, partially hidden by the darkness, watching, waiting. The image made my stomach twist into knots. I couldn't stop thinking about how vulnerable I was. A thin tent wall separated me from whatever was out there. That was it, nothing more. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. My nerves were completely shot. I carefully unzipped a small section of the tent window, just enough to peek outside. The cold night air immediately rushed in. I scanned the clearing with my eyes. Moonlight illuminated patches of ground between the trees. My extinguished campfire sat exactly where I had left it. Everything looked normal, too normal. There was no visible sign of another person, no movement, no shadows, nothing. I kept looking for several seconds. The clearing appeared completely empty. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt even uneasy. If someone had been circling my tent moments earlier, where had they gone? The surrounding forest was dense. There were countless places to hide. I slowly swept my flashlight beam across the trees. The light cut through the darkness. Trunks, branches, and bushes came into view, one after another. Then I noticed something strange near the tree line. At first, I thought it was a tree stump. It stood motionless about 50 yards away, but the longer I looked, the less it resembled a stump. The shape seemed too tall and narrow. My pulse immediately quickened. I focused the flashlight directly on it. The beam reached the object for only a second before it disappeared behind a tree. I froze. I knew what I had seen. Something had moved. Something had been standing there. My heart nearly exploded in my chest. I quickly aimed the flashlight at the same spot again. This time there was nothing, just empty forest. The figure was gone. I kept searching the area, moving the beam from tree to tree. Every shadow suddenly looked suspicious. Every dark shape seemed capable of hiding the person. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from just beyond the light. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't earlier. It felt hostile. I zipped the window closed immediately. Seeing that movement had erased any doubt left in my mind. There was definitely someone out there. I crawled back into the center of the tent and tried to think clearly. Calling for help wasn't an option because there was no cell signal. Hiking out in the dark would be dangerous. Staying put seemed the safest choice. At least I hoped it was. I told myself the sun would eventually rise. I just needed to make it through the night. Easier said than done. Around 3:15 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer than ever. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound stopped directly beside the tent. My breathing became shallow. Then came a slow scratching noise along the outside fabric. It moved from one side of the tent to the other. The sound reminded me of someone dragging their fingernails across the material. I sat frozen in absolute terror, and then, from only a few feet away, I heard the same voice whisper again, except this time it sounded much closer and much clearer than before. The whisper came from so close that it felt like the person was crouching right outside the tent. This time I could make out a few words, not all of them, just enough to make my blood run cold. The voice quietly said, "I know you're awake." Every muscle in my body instantly locked up. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it almost hurt. I stared at the tent wall, unable to move. The realization was terrifying. Whoever was out there knew I was inside, and they knew I wasn't sleeping. For several seconds, I couldn't even breathe properly. My mind struggled to process what I had just heard. The voice had sounded calm, not angry, not aggressive. Somehow that made it worse. If someone was yelling, I could understand their intentions, but this person sounded completely relaxed, almost casual, like they were talking to an old friend. That calm tone made the situation feel even more disturbing. It suggested confidence. I considered shouting back. I thought about demanding to know who they were, but fear kept my mouth shut. Every survival instinct told me not to reveal anything, so I stayed silent. The forest remained quiet for nearly a minute. Then I heard the person slowly walking away. Each footstep grew fainter. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Eventually, the sound disappeared into the darkness. I wanted to feel relieved. Instead, I felt more anxious than ever. The next 15 minutes were some of the longest of my life. I sat completely still inside the tent. Every small noise made me jump. The wind moving through the trees sounded like whispers. Branches rubbing together sounded like footsteps. Fear was taking over my imagination. I checked my phone repeatedly. The time seemed frozen. It felt impossible that dawn was still hours away. All I wanted was daylight. Around 3:40 a.m., another sound broke the silence. This one came from farther away. It sounded like metal striking metal. Clink, then another clink. The noise echoed faintly through the forest. I couldn't figure out what could be making it. There shouldn't have been anyone else out there. The noise repeated several more times. Each one came from a slightly different direction. It almost felt like someone was moving around while carrying metal equipment. The thought made me uneasy. I carefully opened the tent window again. This time I kept the flashlight off. The moon provided just enough light to see portions of the clearing. At first, everything appeared empty. Then I noticed movement near the trees. A dark figure briefly stepped into view. It stood there for only a second before slipping back into the forest. I couldn't make out any details. I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. All I knew was that it was human-sized, and it was definitely real. The sight sent a fresh wave of panic through me. My hands were trembling uncontrollably. I closed the window and backed away from it. Every logical explanation was beginning to disappear. Lost hikers didn't behave this way. Campers didn't spend hours stalking strangers. Whatever this person wanted, it couldn't be good. I started thinking about my options again. None of them looked promising. Staying felt dangerous. Leaving felt even worse. Then something unexpected happened. A second voice echoed through the woods. It was faint but unmistakable. I couldn't understand the words, but it sounded like someone calling out in the distance. The first voice immediately responded. Their reply was too quiet to make out. My stomach dropped. There wasn't just one person out there. There were at least two. That realization changed everything. Suddenly, the situation felt much more serious. The voices continued for a few moments before stopping. After that, I heard movement deeper in the forest. Multiple sets of footsteps moved through the trees. The sounds gradually faded into the distance. For the first time all night, the clearing became completely quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no scratching, nothing. The silence should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like the calm before something worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that they would return. As the night dragged on, exhaustion began fighting against fear. My eyes felt heavy. My body wanted sleep. But every time I started drifting off, some small sound would snap me awake again. I kept staring into the darkness, waiting for sunrise. Then, sometime after 4 a.m., I noticed something unusual. A faint glow appeared between the trees far beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it might be moonlight. Then I realized it was moving. Someone out there was carrying a light, and it seemed to be headed directly toward my campsite. The moving light immediately caught my attention. At first, it was small and distant, barely visible between the trees. But as the minutes passed, it grew brighter. Whoever was carrying it was getting closer. I pressed my face near the tent window and watched carefully. The light swayed from side to side with each step. It looked like a flashlight. My pulse quickened as I realized it was headed straight toward the clearing. After everything that had happened that night, I knew this couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was coming back. I stayed completely still and kept watching. The flashlight beam occasionally flashed across tree trunks and low branches. It was still too far away for me to see who was holding it. The forest around the light remained pitch black. Every time the beam disappeared behind a tree, I felt a brief moment of relief. Then it would reappear again, closer, brighter, closer. My heart pounded harder with every passing second. I couldn't remember ever feeling this scared. Eventually, the light reached the edge of the clearing. I held my breath. The beam swept across the ground and briefly illuminated my campfire pit. Then it moved toward the tent. I quickly ducked back and prayed the person hadn't seen me looking out. The flashlight paused. The beam remained fixed on my tent for several long seconds. Whoever was holding it clearly knew I was there. The realization made my stomach tighten. I felt trapped. The flashlight finally moved away from the tent. I slowly peeked through the window again. A dark figure stood near the tree line. The flashlight hung loosely at their side. Because of the distance and darkness, I couldn't make out any facial features. All I could see was the outline of a person. They weren't moving. They weren't speaking. They were simply standing there, watching my campsite, watching my tent. I expected them to approach. Instead, they remained completely still. Minutes passed without any movement. The sight was almost more disturbing than the footsteps. There was something unnatural about the way they stood there. Most people shift their weight or move occasionally. This person didn't seem to move at all. It was like looking at a statue. Yet I knew they were alive. The flashlight in their hand confirmed that. The silence became unbearable. Then the figure slowly raised one arm. My breath caught in my throat. For a brief moment, I thought they were pointing at me. Instead, they gestured toward the woods behind them. A second later, another figure emerged from the darkness. My stomach dropped instantly. The second person stepped into view near the first. Both figures stood motionless at the edge of the clearing. Neither one spoke, neither one approached. They simply stared toward my tent. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Two strangers had spent hours lurking around my campsite. Now they were standing together in plain sight. I wanted to convince myself there was some innocent explanation. Maybe they were lost, maybe they needed help, but none of their behavior matched that idea. If they needed assistance, they would have asked for it. Instead, they continued watching me in silence. That silence felt deliberate. It felt threatening. The two figures remained there for several more minutes. Then, without warning, both of them turned and walked back into the forest. The flashlight beam disappeared among the trees. Within moments, they were gone. I waited for the footsteps to return. They didn't. I waited for another whisper. Nothing. The forest fell silent once again. For the first time all night, I felt a small amount of hope. Maybe they had finally left for good. As dawn slowly approached, the sky began changing color. The blackness faded into deep blue. Shapes that had been hidden in darkness started becoming visible. Birds began calling from the trees. The familiar sounds of morning returned. Each passing minute made me feel slightly safer. Daylight seemed to weaken whatever terror had controlled the night. I kept watching the tree line. No figures appeared. No lights returned. Everything looked normal again. Finally, just after sunrise, I gathered enough courage to leave the tent. The cool morning air hit my face as I stepped outside. The clearing looked exactly as it had the evening before. At first glance, there was no evidence that anyone had been there. But when I walked around the campsite, I noticed something that made me stop cold. In the soft dirt near my tent were footprints, lots of them. Not one set, not two sets, several different footprints completely surrounding my tent. I stood there staring at the footprints for several seconds. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The tracks were everywhere. Some circled the tent, others led toward the trees and back again. A few came so close that they nearly touched the tent stakes. There was no denying it anymore. People had been walking around my campsite for hours. The evidence was right in front of me. Seeing those footprints in daylight somehow felt even worse than hearing the footsteps at night. I slowly followed one set of tracks away from the tent. They led toward the edge of the clearing before disappearing among the pine trees. Another set crossed over them, then another. It looked like multiple people had been moving around throughout the night. I counted at least 4 different shoe patterns, maybe more. The realization sent a chill through my body. Last night I'd assumed there were only 1 or 2 strangers. The footprints suggested otherwise. There may have been several people watching me. The more I looked around, the more signs I found. Near the fire pit, someone had stepped directly into the ashes. A crushed soda can lay hidden beneath a bush. I knew it wasn't mine. I never brought canned drinks on camping trips. A broken branch rested near the tent entrance. It looked fresh, as if someone had snapped it recently. None of these items were there the evening before. Every discovery confirmed the same thing. I hadn't imagined any of it. People had been here. Part of me wanted to pack up immediately and leave. Another part wanted answers. I needed to understand what had happened. So I decided to explore the area around the campsite before making a decision. I grabbed my backpack, flashlight, and pocket knife. The morning sunlight made the forest seem less threatening. Birds sang from the trees overhead. The atmosphere felt completely different from the terror of the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Some fears don't disappear with daylight. Following the footprints proved difficult. The forest floor was covered with pine needles and fallen leaves. Tracks appeared clearly in some places and vanished entirely in others. After about 10 minutes, I found something unusual. Hidden behind a cluster of trees was a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. The area looked disturbed. Several branches had been broken. The ground showed signs of recent activity. It looked like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. That thought immediately made me uncomfortable. What had caused him to leave so suddenly? I continued searching the area. About 20 yards beyond the campfire, I noticed a small wooden structure partially hidden among the trees. At first, I thought it was a hunting blind. As I approached, I realized it was more like a crude shelter. The walls were made from old plywood and branches. A torn tarp covered part of the roof. The structure looked old but still usable. Someone had clearly spent time there. I stopped several feet away and studied it carefully. Every instinct told me to be cautious. The shelter was empty. At least it appeared to be. I slowly walked closer and looked inside. The interior contained a sleeping bag, several empty food containers, and a rusted lantern. There were also dozens of strange markings carved into the wooden walls. Most of them were simple shapes and symbols. I couldn't understand their meaning. Some looked years old. Others seemed much newer. The sight made me uneasy. The place felt abandoned but not forgotten. Then I noticed something that immediately grabbed my attention. Lying on the floor was a notebook. It was dirty and water-stained, but still mostly intact. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up and carefully opened the cover. Most of the pages were blank. Others contained random notes and sketches. Then I reached a page that made my heart skip a beat. Written in large letters across the paper were 4 words: "Stay away after dark." I stared at the message in silence. A cold breeze moved through the trees outside the shelter. Suddenly, the forest didn't feel welcoming anymore. It felt oppressive. The warning in the notebook could have been a joke. It could have been meaningless. But after everything that happened the night before, it felt very real. I slipped the notebook into my backpack and stepped outside. That's when I noticed something that hadn't been there a moment earlier. Fresh footprints, standing just beyond the shelter. And judging by the sharp edges in the dirt, whoever made 'em couldn't have been far away. I froze the moment I saw the fresh footprints. They were clear and sharply defined in the soft dirt. Whoever had made them had been there only moments earlier. My eyes followed the tracks as they disappeared between the trees. The forest suddenly felt much quieter than before. Every sound seemed distant. Every shadow seemed darker. I slowly turned in a full circle, scanning the woods round me. There was nobody in sight, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. For several seconds I considered following the footprints. Curiosity pushed me forward. Fear pulled me back. In the end, common sense won. I was alone. Whoever had been watching me all night clearly knew the area better than I did. Following them deeper into the woods would be a terrible idea. I backed away from the shelter and started heading toward my campsite. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched never went away. If anything, it grew stronger. The walk back felt longer than before. The morning sunlight filtered through the pine trees, creating shifting patterns across the forest floor. Normally, I would have appreciated the scenery. That day, I barely noticed it. My attention remained fixed on every movement around me. A squirrel darting across a log nearly made me jump. A branch creaking in the wind caused my heart to race. Fear had turned the entire forest into a threat. By the time I reached the clearing, I was exhausted. Back at the campsite, I made my decision. I wouldn't stay in another night. Whatever had happened, I had no interest in finding out more. I quickly began packing my gear. The tent came down first, then my sleeping bag and cooking equipment. I worked faster than I ever had on a camping trip. Every few minutes I stopped and looked toward the trees. Nothing moved, nothing appeared, yet the feeling remained. Someone knew I was there. Someone might still be watching. Within an hour, everything was packed. I shouldered my backpack and took one final look around the campsite. In daylight, it appeared completely ordinary. If someone else had walked into the clearing, they would have seen nothing unusual, no sign of danger, no sign of the terrifying night I had experienced. Yet I knew the truth. I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't wait to leave. The hike back toward the trailhead started quietly. For the first mile, everything seemed normal. Birds called from the trees. The wind moved gently through the forest. I began feeling slightly calmer. Maybe leaving was the right decision. Maybe the nightmare was finally over. Then I noticed something strange. A set of footprints appeared on the trail ahead of me. They looked fresh, very fresh, and they were moving in the same direction I was. At first, I didn't think much of it. Other hikers used the trail occasionally, but the farther I walked, the more the tracks bothered me. The footprints seemed to appear only where the ground was soft enough to leave marks. Whenever I caught up to a section of clear trail, there was no sign of the person who made them. It was as if they were always just out of sight. The possibility made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was ahead of me, watching, waiting. About 40 minutes later, I rounded a bend in the trail and stopped dead in my tracks. Hanging from a tree branch beside the path was a piece of bright red fabric. At first glance, it looked harmless. Then I recognized it immediately. It matched the color of my tent. My stomach dropped. I walked closer and stared at it. Somehow, someone had torn a small strip from my tent during the night, and now it was hanging here on the trail. Someone wanted me to find it. I looked around frantically. The forest was empty. No movement, no voices, no footsteps, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The piece of fabric swayed gently in the breeze. My hands started shaking. This wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever had been outside my tent knew exactly where I was going. They had reached this spot before me. They had left a message without using words, and the message was clear. They had been closer than I ever realized. From that point on, I barely stopped moving. I pushed forward as fast as I could without running. Every minute felt like an hour. Every shadow seemed capable of hiding someone. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the trailhead through the trees. Relief washed over me instantly. My car was still there. The parking lot was empty except for one vehicle, An old pickup truck, the same one I had seen when I arrived. As I approached, I noticed something chilling. Written in the dust on the back window were 4 words that made my blood run cold. "We know you're awake." I stopped walking the moment I read the words on the truck window. My backpack nearly slipped from my shoulder. For several seconds, I simply stared at the message. The letters were uneven, as if someone had traced them quickly through a finger through the dust. "We know you're awake." The exact phrase hit me like a punch to the chest. It couldn't be a coincidence. Those were the same words I had heard whispered outside my tent. Somehow, whoever had been in the woods knew I would see this. I looked around the parking lot. There wasn't another person in sight. The trees surrounding the trailhead swayed gently in the morning breeze. Everything appeared peaceful, normal. But after the night I had experienced, normal no longer meant safe. I hurried toward my car and unlocked the door. Before getting in, I glanced at the old pickup truck again. Its windows were dark. No one appeared to be inside, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from somewhere nearby. The second I got into my car, I locked every door. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the keys. The engine started on the second try. I immediately pulled out of the parking area and headed toward the main road. For the first few miles, I kept checking my mirrors. I expected to see another vehicle following me. Nothing appeared. The road remained empty. Slowly, I started convincing myself that the worst was over. I was leaving the forest behind. Whatever had happened there was finished. About 20 minutes later, I stopped at a small gas station outside a nearby town. I needed coffee, food, and a chance to calm down. The station was quiet except for an elderly man working behind the counter. As I paid for my coffee, he noticed the dirt on my clothes and asked if I had been camping. I told him I had. Then, without thinking, I mentioned the strange events from the night before. I expected him to laugh. Instead, his expression changed immediately. The man stared at me for several seconds before speaking. He asked where exactly I had camped. I described the area as best I could. The moment I mentioned the location, he sighed heavily. Then he glanced toward the front windows as if checking whether anyone was outside. His reaction instantly got my attention. This wasn't the response of someone hearing a silly ghost story. It looked more like someone recognizing something they wished they didn't know about. The atmosphere inside the station suddenly felt tense. According to the man, strange reports had come from that area for years. Campers occasionally mentioned hearing voices at night. Some reported seeing lights moving through the woods. Others described people watching their campsites from the trees. Most dismissed the experiences as imagination. A few left immediately and never returned. Local authorities had investigated several times but never found anything concrete. The stories eventually became local legends. Most people simply avoided talking about them. Hearing this made my stomach sink. I asked him if anyone had ever disappeared there. The old man hesitated before answering. Finally, he admitted that several people had gone missing in the surrounding wilderness over the years. Most were eventually found, some were not. He quickly added that the forest was vast and dangerous. People got lost all the time. But something in his voice suggested he wasn't telling me everything. It felt like he knew more than he wanted to share. Before I could ask another question, a customer entered the station and the conversation ended. I left shortly afterward and continued driving home. The farther I got from the forest, the better I felt. By evening, I was back in my apartment. The familiar surroundings helped calm my nerves. I unpacked my gear and tried focusing on ordinary tasks. For a few hours, everything seemed normal. Then I remembered the notebook I had found in the shelter. Curious, I pulled it from my backpack and began flipping through the pages again. That's when I noticed something I had missed earlier. Near the back of the notebook was a folded piece of paper hidden between 2 pages. I carefully unfolded it. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the area. Several locations had been marked with circles. One of those circles sat directly over the clearing where I had camped. Beside it, someone had written a short note. The handwriting was shaky and uneven. It read, "They only come when you're alone." I stared at the sentence for a long time. It somehow felt more disturbing than everything else. That night I barely slept. Every creak in my apartment made me jump. Every sound outside my window grabbed my attention. Around 2:13 a.m., I found myself staring at the clock beside my bed, the same time I had first woken up in the tent. For a moment, I laughed at myself. I was home, safe, miles away from the forest. Then my phone vibrated on the nightstand. A notification had appeared. It was from an unknown number. The message contained only 4 words: "We know you're awake." I never returned to that part of Montana. In fact, I stopped solo camping altogether after that experience. Some people who hear this story think it was a prank. Others think it was a group of locals trying to scare visitors. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's a logical explanation for everything that happened. But there are details I still can't explain. The whisper outside my tent, the figures watching from the trees, the message on the truck, the note in the notebook, and the text message that arrived at exactly 2:13 a.m. To this day, whenever I wake up in the middle of the night and hear an unexpected sound outside, I still remember that forest, and I still wonder whether those people ever truly stopped watching.